The envelope had been sitting in a classified file for almost 20 years before anyone really paid attention to it. August 1963. The Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. Late evening shift. Most of the staff had gone home. The reading room lights were dimmed. Only the archive storage area remained bright, fluorescent tubes humming their monotonous song above rows of filing cabinets that stretched toward the back wall like soldiers standing at attention. Patricia Wilson had been working as an archivist for 15 years, the last year at the Eisenhower Presidential Library since it opened in 1962. She knew these files the way a farmer knows his land. Every drawer, every folder, every classification marking. She'd handled thousands of documents from World War II, letters from generals, orders from commanders, reports from the field. After a while, they all started to look the same. Military bureaucracy preserved in manila folders, stamped and dated and filed away for historians who might care someday. But this envelope was different. She noticed it during a routine reorganization of personal correspondence files. The classification stamp on the outside didn't match the subject listing in the catalog. Someone had misfiled it years ago, or maybe filed it exactly where they wanted it to stay hidden. The handwriting on the envelope wasn't Eisenhower's neat, disciplined script. It was bolder, more aggressive. The ink pressed hard into the paper like the writer was in a hurry, or angry, or both. Patricia pulled the envelope free and held it up to the light. 4 pages inside, she could tell from the weight. The return address made her pause. 3rd Army Headquarters, August 23rd, 1944. She opened it carefully, the old glue on the flap cracking after 2 decades of darkness. The signature at the bottom of the last page was unmistakable, that bold, rushing scrawl that looked like it was written at full gallop. George S. Patton. But it wasn't the signature that made Patricia Wilson sit down at the nearest desk and read every word twice. It was the content. Patton had written about the Canadians, about their soldiers, their commanders, their operations in Normandy, and he had written something that seemed impossible, coming from a man famous for never praising anyone outside his own command. He had written that they were excellent, not just competent, not just adequate, excellent, aggressive, innovative, professional, words that Patton reserved for the very best units in the American Army, if he used them at all. Patricia had read enough of Patton's correspondence to know his style. He was critical, demanding, competitive to the point of obsession. He rarely had kind words for British commanders whom he considered too cautious. He respected German tactical skill while hating everything they stood for. But praise for Allied forces under someone else's command? That was rare enough to be remarkable. She read the opening lines again. Ike, I need to talk to you about the Canadians. I've been watching how they operate for the past 2 months, and I have things you need to hear, whether you want to hear them or not. The tone was pure Patton, direct, informal with someone he trusted, no diplomatic cushioning, just straight talk between 2 soldiers who'd known each other long enough to dispense with formality. The letter was marked personal and confidential, in red stamp across the top. It had never been meant for anyone but Eisenhower to read, not for staff officers, not for official records, not for history. But here it was, almost 20 years later, waiting to tell its story. Patricia Wilson marked the file and called her supervisor at home. By midnight, 3 senior archivists and 2 military historians were standing around her desk, reading Patton's letter under the harsh fluorescent lights, trying to understand what they were holding. To understand why this letter mattered, you had to understand the man who wrote it, George Smith Patton Jr., 58 years old in August of 1944, just months away from his 59th birthday. Commander of the 3rd United States Army, already a legend among his own troops and a source of constant headaches for Dwight Eisenhower, who valued him as a battlefield commander but struggled to control his aggressive instincts and his talent for creating controversy. Patton had grown up in a family that worshipped military tradition. His ancestors had fought in the Revolutionary War, the Mexican War, the Civil War. He graduated from West Point in 1909, served with Pershing in Mexico, led tanks in World War I, and earned a bullet wound and a reputation for fearlessness. Between the wars, while other officers studied logistics and administration, Patton studied warfare like a medieval scholar studying scripture. He read Caesar and Napoleon. He analyzed Hannibal and Frederick the Great. He believed in reincarnation and was convinced he'd been a soldier in previous lives, fighting at Troy, marching with Alexander, riding with the Crusaders. Some people thought he was crazy. Most people thought he was arrogant. Everyone agreed he was brilliant at one thing: attacking. When Patton's armor got loose in open country, it moved faster and hit harder than any force in the European theater. He pushed his men relentlessly. He demanded speed. He tolerated no excuses. He believed the way to win battles was to make the enemy react to you, to keep them off balance, to never give them time to prepare or consolidate or catch their breath. But he was also competitive to a fault. He wanted glory, he wanted headlines, he wanted to be the one who won the war, not just a supporting player in someone else's campaign. He famously clashed with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whom he considered slow and overcautious. He resented when other commanders got credit for victories. He kept score of how many miles his army advanced compared to others, how many prisoners captured, how many towns liberated. For a man like that to write a letter praising another nation's army was extraordinary. For him to praise an army under Montgomery's command structure was almost unbelievable. But that's what Patricia Wilson was reading in the summer of 1963, and it changed everything historians thought they knew about how the American military viewed its Canadian allies in World War II. Patton's relationship with Eisenhower went back decades. They'd served together at various posts before the war. They understood each other. Eisenhower knew how to use Patton's aggressive instincts while keeping his political damage to a minimum. Patton knew that Eisenhower was one of the few people who could rein him in without losing his respect. When Patton wrote to Ike in his personal correspondence, he didn't waste time on formalities or careful phrasing. He wrote the truth as he saw it, confident that Eisenhower would understand the military context, even if the political implications were complicated. The letter was 4 pages long, typed on official Third Army headquarters stationery. Patton's aide must have typed it from dictation because the language had that rapid-fire quality of someone talking while pacing, thinking out loud, building an argument step by step. Patricia could almost hear his voice in the words, sharp, impatient, certain. He started by admitting his own ignorance. When we first got to Normandy, I'll be honest, I didn't think much about the Canadians one way or the other. They were under Montgomery's 21st Army Group, which meant I wasn't working with them directly. They were just another Allied force, probably capable enough. Not really my concern. I was focused on my own job, breaking out of the beachhead and getting into a fast-moving fight where armor could really be used. That was classic Patton honesty. No pretense of having paid attention from the beginning, no claim to special insight. Just a professional soldier focused on his own mission, as he should have been in the chaos of the Normandy campaign. The Allied invasion of France in June 1944 had been the largest amphibious operation in history. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men. A beachhead carved out of heavily defended coastline at enormous cost. For weeks after D-Day, the Allied armies were packed into a relatively small area of Norman countryside, fighting through hedgerows and small villages, taking casualties, gaining ground, slowly, while the Germans tried to contain them and push them back into the sea. Patton had arrived in France in early July, ready to unleash his Third Army in the breakout operation that would finally get Allied armor into open country. His focus was south and east, driving toward Brittany and then wheeling toward Paris. The Canadian First Army, under overall British command, was operating to the north of the American sector, pushing toward the cities of Caen and Falaise, trying to collapse the German defensive line from a different direction. But something had caught Patton's attention, something in the intelligence reports, something in the after-action summaries that crossed his desk each morning. He started reading about Canadian operations with the same intensity he brought to studying his own army's performance. Then something interesting happened, the letter continued. We started getting intelligence reports about Canadian operations to the north of us, the fighting around Caen, the actions near Falaise, the attempts to break through toward the open ground. And I started paying attention because the reports suggested the Canadians were fighting in ways that met, even by my standards, an impressive level of performance. By Patton's standards, those three words carried enormous weight. Patton's standards were the highest in the American Army. He demanded more from his troops than almost any other commander. He fired officers who didn't advance fast enough. He showed up at the front lines to personally berate soldiers he thought were moving too slowly. His Third Army had the reputation for being the most aggressive, hard-driving force in Europe. For Patton to say the Canadians met his standards was not casual praise. It was professional recognition of the highest order. The letter became more specific, describing what had impressed him about Canadian operations. Patton elaborated on the aggressive spirit he'd observed, the willingness to attack even under difficult conditions, the offensive mindset that he valued above almost everything else in military operations. He noted that this quality seemed more pronounced in Canadian forces than in some British operations in adjacent sectors, a comparison that would prove politically sensitive. He backed up his assessment with concrete examples. The letter referenced the Canadian assault on Verrières Ridge on July 25th, noting that they'd attacked German positions that British forces had previously failed to take. They'd sustained heavy casualties but continued pressing the attack because the strategic objective was worth the cost. They lost a lot of good men on that ridge, Patton wrote, but they understood something that too many Allied commanders don't understand. You can't win battles without accepting casualties. The question is whether those casualties purchase something of strategic value. At Verrières Ridge, the Canadian attacks pinned down German armor that otherwise would have been available to counter our breakout. They paid a price for that, but they accomplished something important. Patricia Wilson, reading this decades later, felt the weight of Patton's assessment. He was acknowledging that Canadian operations, even the costly ones, had contributed to American success in ways that needed to be recognized. This wasn't Patton's usual approach to Allied coordination, which tended toward competition rather than genuine appreciation of complementary efforts. The letter shifted to discussing Falaise, the operation to close the gap and trap German forces in a pocket. The Canadians were assigned to close the northern shoulder of the pocket, while American forces drove up from the south. This put them in the position of attacking directly into the strongest German defenses, facing elite SS units and armored divisions that were fighting desperately to keep the escape route open. Patton's tactical analysis continued, describing how he'd watched Canadian operations carefully because if they failed to close their side, the Germans would escape and the Allies would have to fight them again later. The pressure on the Canadians was enormous. They were attacking through difficult terrain against determined resistance, taking casualties, facing counterattacks from some of Germany's best units, and they kept advancing. In his letter, Patton had noted the exceptional quality of Canadian artillery work, describing fire concentrations that rivaled American gunnery and forward observers who seemed omnipresent on the battlefield. He'd studied their techniques with professional interest, recognizing that they'd clearly developed effective solutions to the problem of breaking through fortified positions. The letter included a comparison that was particularly revealing. Patton's assessment had gone further, comparing Canadian artillery favorably to British gunnery in adjacent sectors, a politically sensitive observation he'd felt compelled to share despite knowing it would complicate Eisenhower's diplomatic challenges. This was Patton at his most analytically honest. He wasn't trying to flatter anyone or score political points. He was assessing military effectiveness based on observed results and drawing conclusions that he felt his superior needed to hear, even if those conclusions complicated the Allied command structure. The letter acknowledged the delicate political situation Eisenhower faced with Montgomery and British command, but from a purely military standpoint, Patton was telling him that the Canadian First Army was one of the most effective forces in the European theatre right now, and the Allies should be paying more attention to how they operated and why they were successful. Patton then shifted to discussing Canadian commanders, particularly General Guy Simonds, who commanded the 2nd Canadian Corps. Simonds was 41 years old in 1944, younger than most senior Allied commanders. He'd risen based on performance rather than seniority. Simonds is aggressive, innovative, and not afraid to try new approaches, Patton wrote. He developed specialized tactics for the Normandy operations, including using modified self-propelled guns as armored personnel carriers. That kind of innovation under combat conditions is exactly what we need more of. The innovation Patton referenced was the Kangaroo armored personnel carrier. Simonds had recognized that moving infantry across open ground under fire was producing unsustainable casualties, so he'd improvised, converting Priest self-propelled guns into armored troop carriers by removing the main armament and adding protection. Simple, practical, effective. Exactly the kind of battlefield problem-solving that Patton respected. The assessment of Simonds continued with professional admiration. Simonds reminds me of some of our better division commanders. He understands combined arms. He's willing to take risks when the operational situation calls for it, and he learns from his mistakes quickly. The Canadians are lucky to have him, and we're lucky to be fighting alongside forces he commands. Patricia Wilson made extensive notes as she read. This letter fundamentally changed the historical understanding of how American commanders viewed Canadian forces. The conventional narrative had been that Americans saw themselves as the senior partners in the Allied coalition, with British and Canadian forces playing supporting roles. But Patton's letter suggested a much more complex and respectful assessment of Canadian capabilities. The letter moved to discussing Canadian soldiers at the individual level. Patton had talked to American liaison officers who'd worked with Canadian units, and they reported that Canadian soldiers were well-trained, disciplined, and motivated. They didn't have the size advantage that American soldiers often had, but they were tough and they knew their business. Many of them were veterans of the Italy campaign, which meant they'd been in combat longer than most American troops. Patton included an anecdote that Patricia found particularly telling. One of his staff officers had been at a crossroads where Canadian and American units were both passing through. The Canadian columns had impressed him with their discipline and efficiency, moving with organization and purpose that compared favorably to some American units the officer had observed. This observation about discipline and organization was significant because Patton was famous for demanding these qualities in his own troops. The fact that he'd noted them approvingly in Canadian forces suggested genuine respect for their professionalism. Then the letter shifted to a more concerned tone. "Here's what concerns me, Ike," Patton continued. "The Canadians are carrying a heavy burden in this campaign. They're attacking into some of the strongest German defensive positions. They're facing elite enemy units. They're taking casualties at rates that would be unsustainable for much longer, and I'm not sure they're getting the recognition or support they deserve from our side." Patton elaborated on this concern, acknowledging that American focus naturally centered on their own operations, casualties, and accomplishments. But he emphasized the need to remember that the Canadians were fighting the same enemy in a different sector, and their success or failure directly affected American operational possibilities. When they tied down German armor at Falaise, that armor couldn't be used against American forces. When they cleared the Scheldt, the Allies got a functioning port closer to Germany. Their operations mattered to American operations. This was strategic thinking beyond Patton's usual focus on his own immediate operations. He was acknowledging the interconnected nature of coalition warfare in a way that suggested deeper understanding than his reputation for single-minded focus might suggest. The recommendation that followed was explicit and unusual, coming from Patton. I recommend that you consider ways to publicly recognize Canadian contributions, not just diplomatic praise but specific acknowledgement of their operational achievements. They've earned it, and frankly, we owe them that recognition given how much we've benefited from their operations, drawing German attention and resources away from our sectors. Patricia Wilson noted that this recommendation was particularly significant given Patton's general disinterest in diplomatic gestures. For him to explicitly suggest that Eisenhower should publicly praise Canadian forces indicated that he felt strongly about the fairness of the issue. The letter concluded with a statement that captured everything about Patton's professional military identity. I know I'm supposed to focus on my own operations and let you handle the bigger strategic picture, but I can't watch good soldiers fighting effectively without acknowledging it, even if they're not under my command. The Canadians are good soldiers, Ike. Damn good soldiers, and we should treat them accordingly. It was signed simply Georgie, the nickname Eisenhower used for Patton in private correspondence. Two old soldiers who'd known each other for years, speaking frankly about what they saw in the chaos of war. Patricia Wilson finished reading the letter for the second time and looked up at the military historians standing around her desk. They understood what they were holding. This wasn't just another piece of wartime correspondence. This was a window into how American commanders actually viewed their Canadian allies, stripped of diplomatic niceties and official public relations. This was Patton being honest about military effectiveness, acknowledging excellence where he found it, and recommending recognition based purely on professional assessment. And it had been hidden in a file for 20 years. The question was why. The answer to why Patton's letter had remained buried for nearly 2 decades became clear when the historians started examining what was actually happening on the battlefields of Normandy in August 1944. The strategic situation that month was both desperate and promising for the Allied forces. After 2 months of brutal fighting in the hedgerows and villages of northern France, the American breakout from the beachhead had finally succeeded. Patton's Third Army was racing through Brittany and then wheeling east toward Paris. But to the north, the Canadian First Army faced a different kind of fight entirely. They weren't racing through open country. They were attacking directly into the teeth of the strongest German defensive positions in France, facing some of the most elite units in the German military. The town of Falaise sat at the center of what would become one of the most crucial battles of the entire Normandy campaign. The Germans had committed massive forces to trying to contain the Allied advance, and now those forces were at risk of being surrounded and destroyed. American armies were driving up from the south. Canadian and British forces were pushing down from the north. If they could close the gap, they would trap the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in a pocket with no escape route. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, thousands of vehicles, the core fighting strength of the German forces in France. But closing that pocket meant the Canadians had to attack south toward Falaise, while American forces attacked north to meet them, and the Germans knew exactly what was at stake. They threw everything they had at keeping that escape route open. SS Panzer divisions, Tiger tanks, elite infantry, experienced commanders who understood that if the pocket closed, the war in France was effectively over. Patton had been watching the Canadian operations carefully because the success of his own Third Army's encirclement depended entirely on whether the Canadians could close their side of the trap. If the Canadians failed, the Germans would escape. They would retreat in relatively good order, pulling back to defensive lines further east, and the Allies would have to fight them again in stronger positions. Everything would take longer, more casualties, more time, more risk, that the war would drag into 1945 and beyond. So when Patton wrote in his letter about watching Canadian operations, he wasn't being casual or making polite observations about an Allied force. He was analyzing whether they could accomplish the mission that his own success depended on. The military historians reading Patton's letter in 1963 pulled out maps of the Falaise battle. They traced the Canadian lines of advance. They looked at German dispositions. They studied casualty reports and after-action reviews. What they found confirmed everything Patton had written. The Canadians had been given an extraordinarily difficult mission, and they'd accomplished it despite facing some of the most intense combat of the entire Normandy campaign. The terrain worked against them. The Norman countryside south of Caen was bocage country, small fields divided by thick hedgerows that had been growing for centuries. Each hedgerow was a potential defensive position. Each field was a killing ground for German machine guns and anti-tank weapons. The roads were narrow and easily blocked. Visibility was limited. Armor couldn't maneuver effectively. Infantry had to advance slowly, clearing each position, taking casualties, moving forward yard by yard. And the Germans defending that ground were not ordinary Wehrmacht conscripts. They were SS troops, fanatical, well-trained, experienced, armed with the best equipment Germany could provide. They knew they were fighting for survival. If the pocket closed, they would be killed or captured. So they fought with the desperation of men who had nothing to lose. The Canadian attacks developed in phases through early August. Artillery barrages that turned the countryside into a landscape of craters and shattered trees. Infantry advancing behind the barrage, trying to reach German positions before the defenders could recover. Tanks supporting the infantry, engaging German armor at close range. German counterattacks hitting the Canadian lines, trying to push them back, keep them off balance, prevent them from consolidating their gains. The after-action reports showed why Patton had been so impressed with Canadian artillery effectiveness. The Canadians had developed sophisticated fire plans that concentrated massive amounts of artillery on relatively small areas. They would saturate a position with high explosive and smoke, suppressing the German defenders long enough for infantry to close and assault. Their forward observers were aggressive, moving with the lead infantry companies, calling in fire on targets as they appeared. Their gunners responded quickly, shifting fire to new targets, maintaining constant pressure on the German positions. The after-action reports from German units facing the Canadian artillery told the story from the other side. German commanders described the bombardments as overwhelming, defensive positions destroyed, communications severed, troops pinned down in whatever cover they could find, unable to move, unable to respond effectively, just trying to survive until the shelling stopped. One SS Panzer Division commander had written in his situation report, "The enemy artillery fire is of an intensity we have not previously experienced. Our positions are being systematically destroyed. Casualties are heavy. Movement is impossible during daylight." This was the artillery effectiveness that Patton had praised in his letter to Eisenhower. Not just adequate fire support, not just going through the motions, but artillery used as a decisive weapon, applied with skill and aggression, destroying enemy defensive capacity and enabling infantry advances that would otherwise have been impossible. The military historians examining this question in 1963 found evidence supporting Patton's assessment about the comparison with British artillery doctrine. Canadian artillery in 1944 emphasized concentration and aggression. British artillery doctrine was more conservative in some sectors, spreading fire across broader areas, prioritizing sustainability over intensity. Neither approach was wrong in absolute terms, but in the specific tactical situation of breaking through strong German defensive positions in the Norman bocage, the Canadian approach was proving more effective. Patton had recognized this because he understood artillery warfare. He knew what worked and what didn't, and he wasn't afraid to state his professional judgment even when it created uncomfortable comparisons between Allied forces. The letter had also focused on General Guy Simonds, and the historians found that Patton's assessment of the Canadian Corps commander was remarkably accurate. Simonds was indeed innovative, he was indeed aggressive, and he was indeed willing to try new approaches when standard tactics weren't working. The Kangaroo armoured personnel carriers that Patton had mentioned were a perfect example. Simonds had identified a specific problem. Infantry casualties were too high when troops had to cross open ground under German fire. The standard solution would have been to increase artillery support or call for more armor or request airstrikes. Simons did something different. He looked at what resources he had available, found self-propelled guns that could be modified, and created an improvised armored personnel carrier that reduced infantry exposure to enemy fire. This wasn't sophisticated engineering, it was battlefield improvisation. Take the gun out of a Priest self-propelled gun, weld some extra armor on, load infantry inside, drive them forward to the objective. Simple, practical, effective. The kind of solution that showed Simons understood the real problem and wasn't bound by doctrine or convention in finding solutions. Patton had built his reputation on exactly this kind of tactical flexibility. He improvised, he adapted, he tried things that hadn't been done before if he thought they would work. Seeing the same quality in a Canadian commander earned his respect, but the letter also revealed something else about Simons that the historians found significant. Simons was willing to accept heavy casualties when the mission required it. He understood the mathematics of war the same way Patton did. Sometimes you had to pay in blood to buy victory. The question wasn't whether to attack when casualties would be high. The question was whether the objective was worth the cost. At Verrières Ridge in late July, Simons had ordered attacks that cost the Canadians dearly. Entire battalions shattered, companies reduced to a few dozen survivors, armor losses that took weeks to replace. But those attacks had accomplished something crucial. They'd pinned down German armor. They'd prevented German reinforcements from moving to other sectors. They'd drawn German attention and resources away from the areas where American forces were preparing to break out. Patton had understood this immediately. He'd seen the strategic value of what the Canadians were doing, even though they were operating in a different sector under a different army group command. He'd recognized that Canadian attacks, even costly ones, were creating the conditions for his own Third Army to succeed in its breakout operation. This was coalition warfare at its most fundamental level. Different national forces under different commanders, pursuing different immediate objectives, but all contributing to a larger strategic plan. Success depended on everyone doing their part. The Canadians were doing theirs, and Patton wanted Eisenhower to know it. The letter had also mentioned individual Canadian soldiers, and the historians found records that supported Patton's observations. American liaison officers assigned to work with Canadian units had filed reports describing the professionalism and discipline they observed. Canadian soldiers were well trained, they knew their jobs, they followed orders, they didn't panic under fire, they maintained unit cohesion even when taking casualties. Many of the Canadian soldiers in Normandy were veterans of the Italian campaign. They'd fought in Sicily in 1943. They'd battled their way up the Italian peninsula through 1943 and early 1944. They'd seen combat before they ever set foot in France. This experience showed in how they fought. They knew the sound of different weapons. They could read terrain. They understood tactics. They'd learned through hard experience what worked and what got you killed. The American officers who worked with them recognized this quality immediately. These weren't green troops learning on the job. These were combat veterans who knew their business, and that experience made them more effective in the brutal fighting of Normandy. One liaison officer's report, filed in July 1944, described watching a Canadian infantry company conduct a night attack on a German position. The report noted the discipline and coordination, squads moving in proper formation, officers controlling the advance, fire and movement executed exactly as trained. The position was taken with minimal casualties because the attack was conducted properly by soldiers who knew what they were doing. This was the kind of professional competence that Patton demanded from his own troops. Seeing it in Canadian soldiers earned his approval. But the letter had also expressed concern. Patton worried that the Canadians were carrying too heavy a burden. They were being given the hardest missions. They were facing the strongest enemy forces. They were taking casualties that would be unsustainable if the fighting continued much longer. And in Patton's judgment, they weren't receiving adequate recognition from their American allies for what they were accomplishing. The casualty figures supported Patton's concern. Canadian losses in Normandy were proportionally higher than American losses in many sectors. They were attacking into prepared defenses rather than exploiting breakthroughs. They were fighting SS Panzer divisions rather than ordinary Wehrmacht infantry. The nature of their mission meant they were going to take more casualties, and they were. By mid-August 1944, some Canadian units were at 50% strength or less. Battalions that had landed in Normandy with 800 men were down to 400. Companies that started with 120 men had 60 or 70 still fit for duty. The rest were dead or wounded or evacuated for medical treatment. These losses were sustainable in the short term because the mission was crucial and the fighting wouldn't last forever. But they couldn't continue at that rate indefinitely. The Canadian Army wasn't as large as the American or British armies. They had fewer replacement troops available. Every casualty was harder to replace. Patton understood this reality because he paid attention to logistics and sustainment, even though his reputation emphasized speed and aggression. He knew that armies were built from finite resources. You could spend lives like ammunition, but eventually you ran out. The Canadians were spending their strength to hold the northern shoulder of the Falaise Pocket, and Patton thought they deserved recognition for it. His recommendation to Eisenhower was explicit and unusual, coming from a commander not known for political sensitivity. He wanted Eisenhower to publicly acknowledge Canadian contributions, not vague diplomatic praise about Allied cooperation, specific recognition of operational achievements, statements that made clear the Canadians had fought effectively and accomplished difficult missions. This recommendation revealed something about Patton that complicated his historical reputation. He was competitive. He wanted glory for himself and his army. He could be petty about credit and recognition. But when he saw genuine military excellence in others, even in forces not under his command, he acknowledged it, and he thought that acknowledgement should be public and specific. The military historian studying the letter in 1963 recognized this as significant. Patton wasn't motivated by politics. He wasn't trying to curry favor with Canadian authorities. He wasn't building diplomatic relationships. He was simply stating what he believed to be a military and moral truth. Good soldiers deserve recognition, and the Canadians were good soldiers. The historians also found something else in the archives, evidence that Eisenhower had read Patton's letter and taken it seriously. In September 1944, Eisenhower made several public statements praising Canadian operations. He specifically mentioned the fighting at Falaise. He visited Canadian headquarters and spent time with Canadian commanders in a way that was unusual for his typically packed schedule. He made a point of acknowledging Canadian contributions in press conferences and official communications. Whether these actions were directly caused by Patton's letter was impossible to prove definitively. Eisenhower might have been planning to recognize Canadian efforts anyway, but the timing suggested that Patton's observations had at minimum reinforced what Eisenhower was already thinking, and possibly prompted him to act more decisively than he might have otherwise. Other American commanders had expressed similar views about Canadian effectiveness, though in less colorful language than Patton used. General Omar Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group adjacent to the Canadian 1st Army. His correspondence and later memoirs consistently acknowledged Canadian professionalism. He noted how Canadian operations drew German strength away from American sectors. He recognized the difficulty of the missions they were given and the competence with which they were executed. General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st Army, worked more closely with Canadian forces during various operations. His reports praised their tactical competence and ability to coordinate with American units. His assessments were more technical and less dramatic than Patton's, but they reached the same basic conclusions. The Canadians were highly effective and deserving of respect. The pattern was clear. American military leadership at the highest levels privately held Canadian forces in high regard. They recognized Canadian fighting quality. They understood the strategic value of Canadian operations. They respected Canadian commanders and soldiers. But this private respect hadn't translated into proportional public recognition, and that was the problem Patton had identified in his letter to Eisenhower: the gap between what American commanders privately knew about Canadian effectiveness and what was publicly acknowledged. The reasons for this gap were complex and rooted in the politics of coalition warfare. The American media focused overwhelmingly on American forces. That was natural and expected. The American public wanted to read about American soldiers and American victories. There was limited space in newspapers and limited time in radio broadcasts for stories about Allied forces. But there was also a more delicate issue. The British were sensitive about their role in the coalition. They'd been fighting longer than the Americans. They'd endured the Blitz and the Battle of Britain. They'd fought in North Africa and Italy. They had more combat experience and a proud military tradition. But by 1944, the Americans were providing the majority of forces and resources for the invasion of France. The Americans were the senior partner in the coalition, whether the British liked it or not. This created tensions that Eisenhower had to manage carefully. Montgomery was already difficult to work with. He was prickly about his status and authority. He resented American dominance. He competed for resources and priority. If the Americans started publicly praising the Canadians while being more restrained about British forces, Montgomery would interpret it as an attack on his leadership and British military competence. Patton's letter, with its comparison of Canadian artillery effectiveness to British performance, would have been politically explosive if it became public. It would have confirmed Montgomery's worst suspicions about American attitudes. It would have created friction within the coalition at exactly the moment when unity was most important. So the letter was filed as personal and confidential. It was read by Eisenhower. It was considered. But it wasn't shared more broadly. It wasn't included in official records. It wasn't mentioned in press briefings or public statements. It was private professional communication between two soldiers, and it stayed private for 20 years. For 20, until Patricia Wilson found it in a misfiled folder and recognized its significance. The publication of Patton's letter in late 1963 created ripples that spread far beyond the community of military historians who first examined it. The letter appeared in the winter issue of Military History Quarterly, accompanied by a 50-page analytical article written by Patricia Wilson and two senior military historians from the U.S. Army War College. The article provided context about the Normandy campaign, explained the strategic situation in August 1944, and analyzed what Patton's assessment revealed about coalition warfare and American-Canadian military relations. Within weeks, the story had been picked up by newspapers across North America. The New York Times ran a feature article. The Washington Post published an editorial about the importance of recognizing Allied contributions. In Canada, every major newspaper carried the story on the front page. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation produced a radio documentary that included interviews with surviving veterans who had fought in the battles Patton described. The reaction from veterans on both sides of the border was profound and emotional. William McLeod, a former Canadian artillery officer who had served at Verrières Ridge and Falaise, read about the letter in a Toronto newspaper on a December morning in 1963. He was in his early 40s now, nearly 20 years past the war. He'd been a young lieutenant in Normandy, calling in fire missions, watching the shells fall on German positions, trying to keep his men alive through weeks of brutal combat. When reporters contacted him for his reaction to Patton's letter, McLeod's response was measured but clearly heartfelt. "We knew we were good at what we did," he said. "We trained hard, we learned from our mistakes, we accomplished our missions." It's validating to know that professional soldiers like Patton recognized that, even if it wasn't widely publicized at the time. Other Canadian veterans expressed similar sentiments. There was no bitterness about the 20-year delay in recognition, no resentment that Patton's praise had been hidden, just quiet satisfaction that the truth was finally on record, that their service and sacrifice had been acknowledged by someone whose professional judgment was beyond question. One veteran, interviewed by the CBC, put it simply, "We didn't fight for recognition, we fought because it was necessary. but it's good to know the truth is finally out there. The American military establishment's reaction was more complex. Some senior officers welcomed the publication as an important contribution to understanding coalition warfare. Others were uncomfortable with Patton's comparisons between Allied forces, particularly his statement about Canadian artillery effectiveness compared to British performance in adjacent sectors. The British reaction was predictably mixed. Some British military historians acknowledged that Patton's assessment was probably accurate based on the tactical situation in Normandy. Others defended British performance and questioned whether Patton, operating in a different sector, had enough information to make valid comparisons. Field Marshal Montgomery, retired and living in England, was furious when he learned about the letter. He wrote an angry response published in the Times of London, characterizing Patton as a showman more interested in headlines than military reality, and dismissing his assessment as typical American arrogance. Montgomery's reaction actually helped rather than hurt the letter's credibility. His defensiveness suggested that Patton had touched a nerve. His attack on Patton's character, rather than engaging with the substance of the tactical assessment, made him look petty and insecure. British military historians distanced themselves from Montgomery's intemperate response, and several wrote thoughtful pieces acknowledging that tactical effectiveness varied across different units and sectors, and that honest assessment of those variations was valuable for understanding the campaign. The most significant impact of the letter's publication, however, wasn't in settling old arguments about World War II, it was in what it revealed about Patton himself. The popular image of George Patton in 1963 was heavily influenced by his reputation as an aggressive, egotistical commander obsessed with his own glory. He'd been dead for 18 years, killed in a car accident in Germany just months after the war ended. His legend had grown in the years since, fed by memoirs from soldiers who'd served under him, biographies that emphasized his flamboyant personality, and the general public's appetite for larger-than-life military heroes. But the letter showed a different side of Patton. More thoughtful, more strategic, more concerned with fairness and recognition for others than the legend suggested. He'd paid attention to operations outside his own command area. That wasn't part of his direct responsibility, but he'd done it anyway because he understood how the different pieces of the Allied campaign fit together. He'd studied intelligence reports about Canadian tactics and operations. He'd analyzed their effectiveness. He'd formed professional judgments based on evidence rather than prejudice or national pride. He'd been willing to make comparisons that would create political problems. The statement about Canadian artillery being more effective than British artillery wasn't necessary to make his point. He could have praised the Canadians without explicitly comparing them to British forces. But Patton believed the comparison was important for Eisenhower to understand, so he made it despite knowing it would be politically sensitive. He'd recommended recognition for forces not under his command. This was unusual. Most commanders focused on getting recognition for their own troops. Patton certainly wanted credit for Third Army's achievements, but when he saw excellence elsewhere in the Allied coalition, his professional integrity required him to acknowledge it. And most tellingly, he'd done all this in a private letter. He wasn't grandstanding for the press. He wasn't building political relationships. He was simply telling his superior officer what he believed that superior officer needed to know, regardless of whether it was convenient or comfortable. This complexity challenged the simple narrative of Patton as a glory-seeking egotist. Yes, he wanted recognition. Yes, he was competitive to a fault. Yes, he could be difficult and abrasive and politically tone-deaf, but he was also a professional soldier who respected military effectiveness wherever he found it, who understood coalition warfare better than his reputation suggested, and who was willing to advocate for others when he thought they deserved it. Military historians began reassessing Patton's character in light of the letter and other documents discovered during the same research. The picture that emerged was more nuanced. A complicated man, brilliant in some ways, deeply flawed in others, but ultimately guided by a professional military code that valued effectiveness and honesty above political convenience. For professional military officers studying coalition warfare, the letter became a case study in leadership. It was cited in courses at the Command and General Staff College. It appeared in training materials about working with Allied forces. It was referenced in strategic planning documents about NATO operations and multinational military cooperation. The lessons drawn from the letter were straightforward but profound. First, recognition matters in coalition operations. Military forces that feel their contributions are acknowledged fight with higher morale and greater commitment. Conversely, forces that feel overlooked or undervalued become resentful and less cooperative. Patton had understood this instinctively. He'd seen Canadian forces doing difficult work, and he'd believed they deserved recognition not just as a matter of fairness, but as a practical necessity for maintaining coalition effectiveness. Second, honest assessment is essential even when politically uncomfortable. Patton's comparison of Canadian and British artillery effectiveness was exactly the kind of statement that diplomats and politicians wanted to avoid, but from a purely military standpoint, it was valuable information. Understanding which tactics and approaches were working better allowed the entire coalition to learn and improve. Suppressing that kind of honest assessment to avoid political friction ultimately hurt military effectiveness. Third, professional respect transcends national boundaries. Patton was an American patriot who believed deeply in American military superiority, but when he encountered excellence in foreign forces, he acknowledged it. His respect for Canadian fighting quality was based purely on professional military criteria. They fought well, they accomplished difficult missions, they met his standards, that was enough. Fourth, leadership requires moral courage to state uncomfortable truths. Patton risked creating problems with his letter. Eisenhower might have been irritated by the political complications. Montgomery would certainly have been furious if he'd learned about it. But Patton believed the truth mattered more than avoiding friction, so he wrote what he believed needed to be written. These lessons remained relevant decades after World War II ended. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949, was built on the same principle of multinational military cooperation that had characterized the Allied coalition in World War II. NATO forces came from different countries with different military traditions, different equipment, different languages, different political systems. Making that coalition effective required exactly the qualities Patton had demonstrated in his letter. Attention to what Allied forces were actually accomplishing, honest assessment of effectiveness, recognition of contributions, and willingness to state truths that might be politically sensitive. Military professionals studying NATO operations in the 1960s and beyond found that the challenges of coalition warfare hadn't changed fundamentally since 1944. National pride still complicated honest assessment. Political sensitivities still made it difficult to make direct comparisons between Allied forces. Recognition and acknowledgement still mattered for maintaining coalition cohesion. The solutions Patton had implicitly recommended, professional integrity, honest communication, recognition based on merit, remained as relevant as ever. The letter also prompted researchers to look more carefully at other classified correspondence from the war period. If Patton's assessment of Canadian forces had been hidden for 20 years, what else might be waiting in archives around the world? The search proved productive. Several additional documents emerged that showed similar patterns. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, had written to Eisenhower in late 1944 praising the Canadian role in operations to clear the Scheldt estuary. The Scheldt was a waterway leading to the port of Antwerp in Belgium. The Allies desperately needed that port to supply their armies as they pushed deeper into Germany. But the Germans had fortified the approaches to the Scheldt with mines, bunkers, artillery positions, and determined defenders. Clearing the Scheldt fell primarily to Canadian forces. It took weeks of brutal fighting through flooded terrain, attacking fortified positions, clearing mines, reducing bunkers. The casualties were heavy, the conditions were miserable, But the Canadians accomplished the mission, opening Antwerp to Allied shipping and solving the supply crisis that had been threatening to stall the Allied advance. Marshall's letter to Eisenhower, discovered in the archives in 1964, noted that Canadian forces had accomplished a difficult mission in challenging conditions against determined resistance. He suggested that their success should be acknowledged in official American reports and communications. Like Patton's letter, Marshall's communication had been filed as personal correspondence, rather than being included in official records. The accumulated documentary evidence painted a clear picture. The gap between private respect and public acknowledgement wasn't because American commanders didn't value Canadian contributions. It was because the politics of coalition warfare made public recognition complicated. Media attention focused on American forces. Diplomatic sensitivities required careful management of British pride. Public statements had to be calibrated to avoid creating friction within the alliance. But in private professional communication between senior officers, the truth was stated clearly. The Canadians were highly effective, they accomplished difficult missions, they deserved recognition, and American military leadership knew it, even if they couldn't always say it publicly. For Canadian military historians, this documentary evidence was invaluable. It provided American validation of Canadian effectiveness from sources whose professional credibility was beyond question. It showed that Canadian contributions to Allied victory had been recognized at the highest levels of American military command, even when that recognition wasn't visible in public statements or official histories. The publication of these documents in the 1960s contributed to a broader reassessment of Canada's role in World War II. Canadian historians had long argued that Canada's military contributions were proportionally larger than most people realized. Canada had a relatively small population compared to the United States or Britain, but it had mobilized over 1 million people for military service. Canadian forces had fought in every major theatre of the war. Canadian industry had produced enormous quantities of military equipment. Canadian training facilities had prepared thousands of